Linda Harris was 62 years old when she realized her retirement wouldn't be what she had imagined. After 38 years teaching high school English in Detroit, her pension came to $1,100 a month, barely enough to cover rent and utilities in a city where even modest apartments had become unaffordable. Her Social Security wouldn't kick in for another 5 years, and the small savings she had accumulated over decades had been wiped out paying for her late husband's cancer treatments. She couldn't afford to stay in Detroit, but she couldn't afford to go anywhere else either. That's when her former student, Marcus, now a real estate agent, called her about an unusual opportunity in Copper Falls, Michigan, a nearly abandoned mining town in the Upper Peninsula where property values had collapsed along with the local economy. The building Marcus told her about had been the Copper Falls National Bank, a grand 3-story structure built in 1889 during the town's copper boom. When the mines closed in 1968, the bank had shut down, and the building had changed hands several times over the decades, housing various failed businesses before finally being abandoned in 1995. It sat on Main Street in a town where the population had dropped from 8,000 to 300, where most buildings stood empty, and where winter lasted 7 months out of the year. The county had seized it for unpaid taxes and was selling it at auction with a reserve price of just $1,000. Marcus thought Linda could get it for under $3,000. And more importantly, the second and third floors could be converted into a livable apartment. The tax burden would be minimal, less than $500 annually. Linda drove up to Copper Falls on a freezing October morning when the first snow had already started to fall. The 9-hour drive from Detroit took her through increasingly remote territory, past shuttered factories and ghost towns, until she reached the Upper Peninsula where forests stretched endlessly in every direction. Copper Falls sat nestled between two hills, a collection of weathered buildings that looked more like a movie set than a living town. The bank building dominated Main Street, its limestone facade blackened with age, its tall arched windows boarded over with plywood. But the structure itself appeared solid, the craftsmanship of another era evident in the detailed stonework and the heavy oak doors. The interior took Linda's breath away, though not in the way she had hoped. The ground floor, which had housed the banking hall, was a disaster of water damage and collapsed ceiling tiles. Pigeons had colonized the space, their droppings covering every surface. The old teller windows still stood along one wall, their brass fixtures tarnished black. Across the room, the massive vault door hung open, its combination mechanism frozen with rust. The second and third floors were in slightly better condition, but would require thousands of dollars in repairs before they could be inhabited. Linda walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing, calculating costs she couldn't afford, and wondering if she had made yet another mistake in a life that seemed full of them lately. She won the auction at $2,800, the only bidder. The transaction was completed in a lawyer's office that smelled of wood smoke, and Linda drove back to Detroit knowing she had burned her last bridge. She gave notice on her apartment, sold most of her furniture, and packed everything else into a U-Haul. 2 weeks later, she was living in a sleeping bag on the second floor of the old bank building with a space heater, a camping stove, and growing doubts about her sanity. The people of Copper Falls were friendly but distant, the way small-town residents often are with outsiders. The woman who ran the general store helped Linda find a handyman willing to work for reasonable rates. The local electrician got power restored to the building. A plumber fixed the worst of the water damage. Linda spent her days cleaning, scrubbing decades of grime from floors and walls, trying to make one room habitable before winter fully set in. She spent her nights wrapped in blankets, listening to the old building creak and settle, wondering what she would do when her money ran out. The basement had been locked since the day Linda first viewed the property. The heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs had a modern padlock on it, and none of the keys she had received with the building would open it. The handyman, a taciturn man in his 70s named Earl, had told her the basement flooded regularly and wasn't worth accessing. "Just storage space and old bank records," he said. "Nothing down there but mold and mouse droppings." Linda had been content to leave it alone, focused on making the upper floors livable. But as November arrived and her renovation projects dwindled, curiosity got the better of her. She bought bolt cutters at the hardware store and spent 20 minutes working the lock before it finally snapped. The basement door opened with a groan that suggested it hadn't moved in years. Cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness below. Linda descended the concrete stairs with a flashlight, stepping carefully on treads slick with moisture. Earl had been right about the flooding. The basement floor was covered in several inches of standing water that reflected her light like a black mirror. But he had been wrong about the contents. The basement was enormous, running the full footprint of the building. Support pillars marched away into the darkness, and along the walls, dozens of metal shelving units held cardboard boxes that had somehow remained above the waterline. Linda waded through the cold water, her boots squelching, and pulled down the nearest box. It was surprisingly heavy and sealed with packing tape that crumbled at her touch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of paper. Linda carefully unfolded one and found herself looking at a stock certificate from 1929, ornately printed and bearing the signature of someone whose name she didn't recognize. She opened another box. More stock certificates, these from various mining companies. Another box held bonds from the 1920s and 1930s. A fourth contained what appeared to be property deeds. Linda stood in the flooded basement, surrounded by boxes of old financial documents, trying to understand what she was looking at. Why would the bank have left these behind? And why were they locked in the basement? Over the next 3 days, Linda systematically examined every box. There were 147 boxes in total, containing thousands of documents. Most were stock certificates and corporate bonds from the 1920s and early 1930s, representing investments in companies ranging from railroads to mining operations to early automobile manufacturers. Many of the companies had clearly failed during the Great Depression. But mixed among them were certificates from companies Linda recognized: General Electric, US Steel, Standard Oil, AT&T. These weren't just historical documents, they were potentially still valid securities. She found the explanation in a leather-bound ledger tucked in a box near the back wall. The ledger was the personal journal of Harold Whitmore, president of Copper Falls National Bank from 1925 until his death in 1967. The entries painted a picture of a small-town banker who had watched his community's economy collapse during the Depression. Many local customers, unable to repay loans and facing ruin, had surrendered their investment portfolios to the bank in settlement of debts. Whitmore had kept these securities in the vault, believing some might eventually regain value. But as the years passed and the customers died or moved away, the securities had been forgotten, accumulating in the basement along with other abandoned property. Whitmore's final entry, dated December 1966, indicated his awareness that the bank would soon close due to the mine shutdowns. He had moved the securities to the basement and locked them away, writing, "These papers represent the lost dreams of good people who trusted me to keep their money safe. I failed them during the Depression, but I cannot bring myself to destroy what remains. Perhaps someday they will have value again. Until then, they are safe here in the dark." Linda took photographs of several certificates and drove 3 hours to Marquette, the nearest city with reliable internet access. She spent an entire day at the library researching. Stock certificates from the 1920s and 1930s were collectible, worth anywhere from $10 to several $100 each as historical curiosities. But certificates from companies that still existed could potentially be redeemed if they had never been officially canceled. The process would be complex, involving authentication, corporate record searches, and potentially legal proceedings. Many would prove worthless, their value dissolved by mergers, bankruptcies, or reissues. But some, particularly those from companies that had survived and thrived, could be worth substantial sums. Linda contacted a securities attorney in Chicago who specialized in historical financial instruments. She sent him photographs and detailed inventories. His response came 3 days later, marked urgent. "Please call me immediately. This is significant." The attorney, David Brenner, explained that many of the certificates appeared legitimate and potentially valuable. He offered to handle the authentication and redemption process in exchange for a 30% commission. Given the volume of documents and the complexity of the work, Linda agreed. The authentication process took 7 months. Brenner's team examined each certificate, tracing corporate histories, checking transfer records, and negotiating with various companies' investor relations departments. Many certificates proved worthless, their companies long dissolved, or their shares cancelled in corporate restructurings. But others were valid. A bundle of General Electric certificates from 1929 had split and grown over the decades into shares worth $89,000. Standard Oil certificates, accounting for the company's multiple divisions and subsequent mergers, were worth $137,000. AT&T holdings had appreciated to $204,000. Dozens of smaller holdings in companies that had survived and been acquired added up to significant amounts. The total value came to $2,400,000. After Brenner's commission and various authentication fees, Linda would net approximately $1.6 million. She sat in her now renovated apartment on the second floor of the old bank building, looking at the final accounting, unable to fully process what had happened. 7 months ago, she had been a desperate retiree with $2,800 and no prospects. Now she was a millionaire, all because a forgotten banker had been unable to throw away the financial remnants of his customers' ruined dreams. But as Linda read through Harold Whitmore's journal again, she felt the weight of those dreams. These weren't just anonymous stock certificates. Each one had belonged to someone, a miner or shopkeeper or teacher, who had invested their savings in American prosperity and lost everything when the economy collapsed. Whitmore had felt responsible for those losses, even though they were far beyond his control. He had preserved these papers as a kind of memorial, never imagining they might someday regain value. Linda made a series of decisions over the following weeks. She used part of the money to fully restore the bank building, turning the ground floor into a community center and small museum dedicated to Copper Falls' history. She worked with local genealogists to identify descendants of Whitmore's original depositors, tracking down family members who had scattered across the country. Where she could establish clear lineage and legitimate claim, she shared portions of the recovered value. For one woman in California, that meant a check for $57,000, representing her grandfather's lost General Electric shares. For a family in Ohio, it meant $23,000 from mining company bonds. Not everyone could be found, and many families had no surviving descendants. But Linda distributed nearly $400,000 to people who had as much right to the money as she did. The rest she invested carefully, establishing a fund to provide college scholarships for students from Copper Falls and other dying mining towns across the Upper Peninsula. She created an endowment to maintain the bank building and museum. She bought and renovated several abandoned buildings on Main Street, offering them to small businesses at minimal rent. The town began to change, slowly, as new people discovered that Copper Falls had become affordable again. A coffee shop opened, then a bookstore. An artists' cooperative moved into the old hardware store. Linda kept the basement as she had found it, the metal shelves still holding boxes of documents that had proved worthless as securities, but invaluable as history. She gave tours to school groups and visitors, telling the story of Harold Whitmore and the customers who had trusted him with their futures. She showed them the stock certificates with their elaborate engravings and the bonds promising repayment in gold. She explained how the Great Depression had destroyed lives and how one small-town banker had tried, in his limited way, to honor the people who had lost everything. On the anniversary of her purchase, Linda stood in the old banking hall, now cleaned and restored to something approaching its former grandeur, and thought about the strange mathematics of loss and recovery. Harold Whitmore had locked those securities away in shame, believing he had failed his community. Linda had stumbled upon them in desperation, looking for nothing more than a place to live out her retirement in dignity. Together, across 50 years, they had accidentally preserved a fortune that would never fully compensate for what had been lost, but might help prevent some future losses. The building she had bought for $2,800 had yielded $2.4 million in forgotten securities. But that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure was discovering that failure isn't always final, that preservation has its own value, and that sometimes the things we save out of sentiment prove more valuable than anything we saved for profit. Harold Whitmore had been right to keep those papers safe in the dark. He just hadn't lived long enough to see why. Linda, through pure accident and desperate necessity, had become the custodian of his faith that value endures, even when it takes decades to recognize it. She had bought an abandoned building looking for shelter and found instead a second chance, not just for herself but for an entire community that had been written off as dead. That kind of discovery, she understood, was worth more than any amount of money, though having the money certainly helped.